Hello and welcome to the Rippling Pages with me, Liam Bishop, curating the best writers to inspire you and your writing. Now, if you were to meet a time traveler from the future, what would you ask them? This is the question Roisin Dunnett asks in her novel, A Line You Have Traced, published by Magpie Books. Spanning over 3 centuries, three women are connected by forces they, at first, don't understand. From post-World War I Britain to East End London's modern queer scene, to a portentous dystopian future, Roisin's novel is coded with messages between the past, the present, and the future. Both angels and time travelers, as well as a mysterious red book, might give secrets to all in this book that seems to have it all. But it's also an artful literary novel, with some calling it in the vein of David Mitchell, Ursula Le Guin, and Octavia Butler. Roisin's fiction pamphlet, Animal Vegetable, was published in 2021 by Broken Sleep Books. Her short fiction has been published in Prototype, Partisan Hotel, Ambit Victuals, and many other places. She has an MA in Creative and Life Writing from Goldsmith University, and she was also longlisted for the Pat Kavanagh Prize in 2022. Roisin, thank you very much for joining me on the Rippling Pages.
Thank you for having me.
Just before I get going, actually, remember to like, share, follow, subscribe, or leave a review of the Rippling Pages if you enjoy this episode, or of course any other episode of the show. And yeah, but you are in London, you're in Walthamstow, which is where this trans-historical future, past, present, future novel is set. So I just wondered, Roisin, I tried to give the listeners a bit of a flavour in the introduction, but can you just give us an idea of what this novel is about?
It is, yeah, it's three women, three protagonists living sort of about a century apart. So about a century in the past, in kind of 1920s, 30s, East London, a kind of time that looks like now, a kind of broadly contemporary era, and then a kind of imagined, well, all futures are imagined, aren't they, 100 years in the future. And their lives kind of intersect, partly just through the kind of world of coincidence, kind of echoes and kind of duplicates that you can only really observe as the reader that they're not aware of. And then there are these kind of archival elements that bring them together, notebooks and photographs and things like that. And then they are also connected through the medium of a time machine. Yeah, I've tried to kind of use all of these devices to think about what we can kind of imagine into being, what we owe to the future, what we owe to the past, the way that things are connected. Somebody once said to me that like the past only appears to repeat itself because that's our only sort of reference point for what's happening now. And I think that's an interesting way to kind of look at the sort of cyclical nature of some elements of history, that we goes and we recognize these things, but also they have these profound differences that is hard for us to understand because we're living through them. And yet at the same time, the past obviously does contain messages and lessons and information that is vital to us as a kind of culture. Very, very rarely seem to learn from them, as far as I can tell, certainly now.
Interesting. Thanks for that. Thanks for summarizing that, because it is, yeah, there's a lot going on. And it's fantastic, and it's visionary, and it's artful, it's literary, it's full of fantastic crafted sentences. So is there anything then, talking about the past repeats itself, was there a specific event that you thought we haven't learned from that inspired this novel?
I think that what I was struck by is that we find it very difficult to kind of imagine a future outside of the kind of the parameters that we have in our present. It's very difficult to kind of force yourself outside of kind of contemporary norms, and that has always been the case. And then that it is also, I think, quite difficult, generally speaking, to kind of imbue the people and the movements of the past with the complexities that we offer ourselves. And so I guess one really simple and obvious one that I can think of is that people are like really happy to praise and sort of iconize certain protests of the past, like the suffragettes or the Battle of Cable Street, which is one that I reference in my novel, as kind of, you know, these effective, necessary, and kind of heroic acts of protest that led us to where we are today. Like, of course, you know, women should have the vote, and so they were right to advocate for themselves and to have these protests in order to have the votes. And of course, we shouldn't have fascists wandering around in the East End, and so people were quite right to stand up and say that those things shouldn't happen. But actually, at the time, obviously, these people were considered radical and different. And actually, even, you know, when it comes to the Battle of Cable Street, the Jewish Board of Deputies advised people to stay at home. Like, it wasn't even kind of people that didn't have skin in the game that weren't saying, you know, actually, this is probably a little bit too radical and crazy and it could get dangerous. So just like, don't get into it. But there were, you know, really interesting kind of local coalitions and groups of people, and you know, people who had been sort of running anti-fascist groups and kind of doing strikes and kind of building kind of local connections with other groups of people who were really invested and prepared for this to happen and knew what needed to go on. It wasn't just this kind of spontaneous act. Now when you look at people doing similar things in relation to, for instance, climate, so people like Just Stop Oil, there is the sense that people are unable to apply that respect to something happening in the kind of contemporary sphere. And I suppose that is something that I thought about a lot, how basically if a protest is happening now, it's not okay. And if a protest has happened in the past, then that was a good thing to have done. So I think in terms of what, you know, one of the ways in which I was thinking about how history repeats itself, I guess it was around the area of kind of protest and who was allowed to protest and what we should be protesting about. And as far as I can tell, in terms of people that object to current protests, you basically shouldn't really be protesting or advocating for anything that isn't already kind of pretty firmly in place.
But this is a book about women. I think it's about women, and it's about narratives of women. And I don't know if you can just then tell us about the different people in history, about who the stories center around.
It is a sort of fictionalized history. Like you know, I've sort of smashed certain times and places together a little bit, which I've done throughout the novel. I've just kind of condensed, and like I've done it with time and place. I've kind of some of the occurrences of like a couple of decades together, and then also kind of pushed some postcodes together to kind of, you know, keep everything where I want it to be. But yeah, broadly 1920s, 30s, East London. B is a young, fairly recently married sort of housewife slash she works in her husband's silverware shop. She's still kind of reeling from the death of her parents and feeling kind of quite unmoored in that way. But she does find a lot of happiness and meaning in her work. She's kind of in conflict with her husband, but they do also sort of understand each other quite deeply. And she has this very profound and kind of sustaining friendship with a woman called Cece, who's, you know, also lives in the area. And she has also, since the death of her parents, and she's not sure how close a connection to sort of mate with that, she has started having visions of what she's choosing to call angels, or a sort of singular angel that appears to her again and again in all of these different ways. And at the beginning of the novel, she's kind of registered the fact of that, but is really struggling to put meaning to it. And then the contemporary section concerns someone called Kay, who's living in East London and sort of working these casual jobs. She's a temp receptionist in corporate offices, and she works as a gallery invigilator, which is sort of where you sit and guard the art and tell people where the toilets are. You know, the rest of the time she's kind of out and clubbing and watching performances and dealing with at times quite severe consequences from that. But she also has this sense that even though she sort of just wants to sort of wander around and have a good time, you know, there needs to be something further. And she is also probably connected to this. She's incredibly preoccupied with this novel that she's discovered, which is kind of the thing of family legend, which is that a novel was written about her great grandfather in Jewish East London, and he was made the protagonist, and she discovers this novel, finds the way that her relative was written about to be really very uncomfortable, but nevertheless becomes kind of obsessed with the book. And so when she's not out or working, she takes herself off to a library where there's this one copy of this book left, and she just reads it and reads it and reads it, and is kind of compelled back to it by forces that she can't quite explain. And then in the future, about 100 years in the future, there is a character called S, who is part of a kind of anarcho-commune. The organization is called The Network, and it has these different kind of outposts where people are kind of living together and trying to kind of make a life on the outskirts of a larger city. The one that she lives in is kind of built on a kind of spare patch of ground on the Walthamstow marshes. And the kind of sect of that organization that she is a part of specifically believes that we're nearing the end of the human chapter, and that this is really it's the end of the road, and that the most kind of ethical thing that they can do is to try to live together as humans in a fair and just way, and just sort of prepare the way for a world without us. And that is kind of a way that she's reconciled herself to that to some degree and kind of made meaning from that realization.
Wow. Did any of these come first then?
I think that the contemporary figure Kay, a version of this character kind of already existed in terms of tone and register, because it's the part of the novel that's written in the first person. I've written short fiction in the first person that has not exactly the same register, but a similar kind of colloquial kind of rhythm and humor. And so in that sense, her sort of template existed first, but they all kind of had to develop in conjunction with each other, because that's kind of how the story, it's not sort of told past, present, future, that, you know, they're sort of, it's very entangled. And so their characters kind of developed in quite an entangled way.
Definitely. That's how I felt. And you obviously you know that it's different time. You're in a different part of history or the future. But it is at times it felt like you were trying to maybe purposefully make it difficult to know where exactly you were in the novel. And I think that maybe that then does that relate to the sense of, and thinking about some of the things we spoke about at the start of this, you know, does this relate to perhaps the character's sense of difficulty in knowing how to deal with the past and the future?
Yeah, I think so. There's kind of lots of ways, I hope, in which it can kind of feel at times sort of a little bit out of time. But one quite sort of specific thing is that I don't mention times or places at all. So all of the kind of really clear references that we've made to kind of, you know, East London, none of that exists in the book on the page, which is not to say, you know, I think it's fairly clear where I'm coming from most of the time, although I've written it, I hope I've written it in such a way that if you don't have pre-existing knowledge of, say, the Battle of Cable Street, that doesn't make the book any more difficult. I mean, it is a style that I use generally, but obviously that is very challenging when you're writing a book that is all about people living in different time periods. And I think that, yes, I wanted to create a sense that these kind of historic lines could cross at any place and at any time, and that, you know, our sort of footing in our sort of different epochs are not as kind of sure as we think that they are.
Interesting. Well, I want to talk to you then about visions and sensations. Because the characters endure a lot of these in the book. They get visions of angels, of time travelers, and for me, it was about what do we pay attention to, and how do we read these visions. And some of the things you've been speaking about here would seem to allude to that as well. Perhaps this is a question then about the craft of the book.
It's interesting that you sort of picked up on, yeah, the sort of the theme of kind of visions and of dreams, because I think that perhaps something that we kind of don't pay as much attention to in kind of what can I sort of I guess ordinary existence, is that actually like quite a lot of our daily lives are composed of like one form of vision or another. Like you've got, you know, dreams, of course, but then also, you know, yes, sure, some people experience, you know, sort of religious and ecstatic visions, and you've got your you know, hallucinogenic visions and all that kind of thing. But I would also say that, you know, the kind of visionary element of our lives, like a daydream that gets out of control, or, you know, something that you experience just on the edge of sleep, or a kind of conversation that you kind of imagine having as you're, you know, cycling somewhere. We're operating in the kind of visionary realm all of the time. And that really is the place where we're also like the most out of time, especially in dreams, where time passes in like a completely different way to the way that it does in kind of like waking and terrestrial life. So it is a kind of place of kind of temporal freedom and of kind of personal freedom. And yeah, that kind of felt really important. And I think to sort of, I don't know, I think something that I quite enjoy doing in fiction is trying to properly explain and articulate the experience of having certain thought processes and kind of imagining certain things and having, you know, say a shock or a vision or a hallucination. I do like doing that without it becoming too kind of internal and self-indulgent and kind of yeah, I think that there's like a line to be drawn there, because you can just go on for ages in that vein. With the term angel, with the term time traveler, we kind of always assume that these figures are visiting us for a reason, right? So if you have, whether it's a hallucination or a vision, or you are really visited by an angel or a time traveler, there's the assumption that they have something to say to you. That's why they're here.
Well, one of the characters for sure gets these feelings or these sensations. So the messages aren't always visual either. Sometimes the
Mhm.
messages are felt within the body or in the acts that they're doing. How did you set about choosing how these characters respond to these different types of messages? And how does it play out in their narratives?
So I suppose that I always intended for sort of be as a character to be propelled through time into in such a way that she kind of had a vision of like the kind of immediate and the broader future that sort of gave her this really frightening imperative to try and act in some way, her personally, to like her people and to her culture, and then kind of to the world in general. And that would sort of force somebody who was kind of otherwise just trying to get on with their lives and reckon with kind of, you know, their grief and their marriage and their kind of, to sort of be shaken up into something. But then in another way, I suppose I thought that's something that kind of happens to her and she sort of loses her mind a little bit. But actually I think that sort of imperative of like, you know, that we're on the edge of something terrible and you have to do something. I think that is something that Kay in the contemporary era would really welcome. Any kind of message about, you know, what is going to happen and what she needs to do would be, she's sort of left by the end of the novel continuing to just have to make decisions in a very conventional way, which is just to kind of move through life and make the best decisions you can and kind of learn what you think is worth learning and kind of move forward in that way. Whereas the other two characters have these very extreme experiences that kind of influence what is going to kind of happen with the rest of their, you know, or not the rest of their lives. Yeah, sort of, I guess I guess I gave them what they didn't want. Bees really jolted out of like a total fantasy world in which everything's fine.
Other ways to connect with the world, perhaps we might call it, that aren't always quantifiable. Either way, I think it's something that it's a form of knowledge, isn't it? Maybe that sometimes the body knows what the mind doesn't, and I think that's being open to it, maybe, and receptive to it, which I think obviously he is on some level. And does it, you know, does it? How does it? I guess it might be a question for readers to find out how that benefits her or doesn't benefit her. Anything that's kind of out there that might be telling us, you know, about a way to live, maybe, and how
But
we get.
definitely, I think what you said about kind of, you know, whether they benefit the characters or not. I mean, I think that's kind of sort of an essential question in life, right? How beneficial is it to be aware, to be conscious, to be concerned?
Interested. And what I'm going to do now, Roisin, is we're going to have a quick break on the Rippling pages. We have done the past. We're in the present, which is now the break, and the future is right after the break. That was quite smooth, that wasn't it? So
That was
do come back.
great.
um,
Wow.
that was like Wogan-esque. That wasn't it. Did you know that there is a Rippling Pages bookshop? Well, it's not a real bookshop, but it is online and it's hosted by bookshop.org.uk. On there, you can access all of the books of the Rippling Pages guests. That includes Roisin's that's just been published by Magpie Books. If you'd like to access the bookshop, you don't need to travel there, you don't need to get the bus there or anything like that. You just need to follow the link in the show notes. And the best bit, all the books are sourced from indie bookshops. So you're supporting indie books too by buying from the Rippling Pages bookshop. Okay, let's get back into it and let's get back to Roisin Dunnett's A Line You Have Traced. Welcome back to the Rippling Pages. I'm here with Roisin Dunnett talking about a line you have traced. So even if you had an idea of what the future looks like, which some people do think they have, because that's what spurs them into action. But even if you had an idea of the future, do you think these characters, do you think we as people would be able to hold it?
Well, I suppose, yeah. I mean, that is almost the question that Bee asks her friend Cece when she sort of says, you know, I've had this, you know, vision of the future, and you know, things are really bad, and what are we going to do? You know, I've been visited by this vision, and Cece, who is, you know, a politically active anti-fascist in interwar East London, is like, well, I haven't been visited by a vision, but I do know that we're not in a good situation. You know, this is an awareness that she's basically saying we all have visions of the future. You know, it is true that, you know, when you're looking forward. You know, you don't necessarily have kind of objective and provable truths, but we do live with what is very, very likely to happen every single day. Nearly everybody does, unless you're living in a state of like probably quite blissful ignorance, which as an adult you really have to cultivate, I'd imagine. If we were to be certain what was going to happen in the future, let's say, yeah, let's go back to climate, you know, would we be able to act effectively? So far, the answer seems to be no, because we do know what's going to happen, and we also do know what to do. And when I say we, I don't really mean us as individuals. Like, you know, yeah, there is a level on which, you know, I don't know, try not to drive as much and recycle. I think these things are important, but you know, I think really, I think what's challenging is perhaps not the question of the what should we do and the, you know, what is going to happen, but the how. I think the how is what the future part of the book particularly is really preoccupied by. How do we build that world when, you know, there are much larger systems that exist against us, and when people just interpersonally are quite fallible, and when a lot of people that kind of understand perhaps the kind of social benefits of kind of cohabiting and living in coalition actually just want to be left alone, and just do their own thing. You know, how do you get there? And I think that is kind of where kind of imagination and visionariness, it's kind of is an answer to that challenge, which is basically, I'm definitely not the first one to say this, but like, you, in order to create a future that you want to see, you have to be able to imagine it. You have to be able to kind of envisage what it will be like and proactively take, you know, steps towards it.
Yeah, manifest it. And I guess you're after, it's okay for an individual to do that, but I guess you're asking for a collective manifestation, aren't you? For something as big and broad as climate that affects every single one of us.
Yeah, I think collective manifestation is a really interesting way to phrase it, because I think that, yes, there's collective action, and there is, as you say, collective manifestation and kind of collective imagining, and kind of being able to collaborate in that way as well, being able to kind of think alongside each other and accept difference, but still kind of continue forward. And I suppose, you know, the book is also trying to think about, yeah, sort of like intertemporal collective manifestation. I guess, how can we allow the imaginations of the people of the past and the people of the future to kind of contribute to what we do now? How can we kind of embody their imaginations and kind of understand them and make use of them? Because really, it's like that, as well as a kind of, you know, contemporary collectivity, we need to kind of draw from the ideas and the actions of people from other times in history as well.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think people will do that?
That's a good question. Yes, I do. And I think people do already. Whether or not that collective manifestation will kind of lead us to a kind of successful place. I do think that, you know, there are I guess there are bad actors who are collectively manifesting different worse things. I think there are fewer of them, but I think they're more powerful and they have more money. So I think that, you know, collectively manifesting a solution to, you know, I don't know, Elon Musk is a whole other ball game, isn't it? Well, no, it's not. It's all the same ball game. But yeah. Do I think we can do it? Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Maybe
I
we'll
have
have to
to.
do it. Yeah, maybe we'll
Yeah.
have to at some point. Well, if I could just bring it back a little bit just to you and the novel, if you don't mind. I want to talk about the environment, but I want to talk about the environments of your novel and about the marshes that you write about. And it kind of anchors the book a little bit, I would say. And some of the language you choose in writing about the marshes. There's also this wandering quality to the book as well. You know, you've got a lot to get in, but there are these moments where there are just sort of passages of the characters moving around the environment and interacting with it and describing it. Um, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about your inspiration for these marshes that within the novel and where they might be.
Yeah. I mean, I had and continue to have like quite a sort of intimate, I guess, relationship with those marshes, and kind of, yeah, it's yeah, an area of land kind of along the River Lee, that kind of is sort of broadly between Walthamstow on one side and kind of Clapton on the other. But it's a kind of massive area, and it's a sort of, to call it kind of a large green space in a city is kind of to undersell how it is kind of you know, quite carefully kind of cultivated and looked after, so not untouched, but a kind of very sort of wild big ecosystem. in a very big city, and like very near to where I live. For a long time, walked there sort of nearly every day, and over lockdown certainly did walk there every day for ages. I was sort of given what for me had been an experience that I hadn't really had from childhood, which was kind of, or since childhood, which is kind of the ability to sort of observe a natural space and the way that it changes every single day, what plants grow, what plants die back, the way that the colors change, the way that kind of different sort of birds and animals are kind of hanging around, and the sort of water levels on the marsh change as well. So the way that you have to map through it, the routes that you have to take change depending on where the water is or isn't. As I kind of describe in the novel, often the water is hidden by the grass. So what appears to be is solid ground is actually a very large area of water with bits of grass sticking out of it. And that does, unusual things to the light, because you have this kind of shimmer over everything. And it's obviously an interesting place to kind of think about things. True nature kind of can hide itself from you, but Earth has like a lot to offer us. I suppose that I sort of rediscovered nature in a very particular way and got very into kind of learning the names of the plants and the different species that were there. And actually in the novel, the only character that really knows how to name all of these plants is S, because that's kind of her area of expertise, and I sort of gave that to her. Whereas the other two characters are kind of a lot more like the way that I've lived most of my life, which is kind of knowing and appreciating that there were kind of, birds and bushes and trees and flowers, but kind of not necessarily being able to kind of populate that landscape with individual characters, just seeing them as a kind of a mass. But also because I spent so much time on the marsh, I did a lot of thinking about the book and about kind of life and about speculative fiction while walking around. So it's not just that the book takes inspiration from the marsh, it's also that kind of like my physical experience of the space walking through it is like really intimately knitted together with thinking about the ideas that belong to the novel, and not just kind of thinking about the novel, but like I would listen to sort of news and political podcasts while sort of walking along the Lee, and then I would like listen to a science fiction short story collection plowing through like an area of marsh like up to my shins, and so all of the kind of ideas that I wrestle with in the book are kind of topographically connected to the marsh.
Yeah, it had that. That's really lovely. It's really interesting. This novel spans so much time and place. This had the feeling of somewhere that was really personal to you and that you knew. And I think that's really nice because there's places that I know that I see every day of my life, but they still have an effect on me, and they still sort of inspire me in different ways. And a really strange way, it reminded me of some of the ways that Dickens would write about London. And there were these very personal places to him that became the underpinning of his novels. And thinking about a novel like Great Expectations or something like that, which is set in the marshes and which is about a vision from the future to some extent. Not that this was a novel, that you were in debt to Dickens or anything like that, but it just had that sense of this was a really personal place, and it held these not mystical qualities, but powerful qualities that have given you, inspiration and messages about how to treat the world, how to treat people.
And I do think that is mystical in the sense that, part of what this novel thinks about and that I think about is that, there is a reality to the mystical. Like some places truly do have mystical qualities in that, there are things about them that are not, easy to kind of pinpoint or be clear about, that nonetheless have like material effects on, your thinking and your ideas and the way that you move through the world.
Some of my favorite moments in reading this were reading about those, just reading, the descriptions of the marshes. And yeah, it's something and I think that's a message. Whoever reads this book, or whoever doesn't read this book, whoever it is, whether you believe in climate change or whether you take any action or no action, I think that everyone has somewhere close and personal to them that they care about. And if that gets tarnished in some way, or if that gets affected by things that are outside of their control or things that are outside of litter, anything like that, anything that tarnishes this image of this place, then they would be affected by that.
And it's very confronting to have that happen. You do hear about people that kind of become just really obsessed with specifically littering in their area, which is something that I used to kind of not. I mean, yeah, sure, get rid of litter, but I kind of couldn't really get there on an emotional level, I guess, because I kind of was like, well, there's bigger.
But my dad and I are different, but he is very, very, gets very concerned, like I said, when he sees, litter out and about, and he'll pick it up and put it in a bin. And it's just very interesting how how attached he is to sort of these places, and this is something that, and he's become more attached to it, I think, and he's become more concerned about climate change as he realizes what could happen. But it's also that thing, isn't it? Anyway, I'm going down a path here, but
no, I mean, my dad also picks up litter, and so I'm like, we could just talk about like how dads deal with things existentially, and
does
like
your
that's a
dad
whole
pick up
other
litter?
thing.
Phone in to the Rippling Pages and let me know if your dad picks up litter.
Yeah.
But I think, well, just to finish off, then I don't know if you could just, if you have time or interested to do so, just reflect on your writing journey, how you got to publication. I think listeners are always sort of interested to hear about this, and I think the question for me is that I didn't really see, in your short stories that I've read, I didn't see like ironically a portent of this big novel was somewhere. Do you know what I mean? So I was really curious to sort of how you got to where you are now.
I think the size of the long form one in comparison to the short ones is, you know, that it's they're very different genres, I think, for me, short fiction and long form fiction. But I wrote short fiction for a long time, like in my sort of journey as a writer. And initially it was just because I sort of felt like it was a good way to practice, and then I became really involved with the form, and it's something that I really enjoy. And a lot of the same concerns are there, I think. Yeah, sort of climate and sort of natalism and maternity and the kind of weirdness of bodies, and as is the sort of weird visionary element. But I guess the length of the novel and the kind of the expansiveness with which you can kind of explore those ideas when you do something long is, you know, it's always going to feel quite different. But I've written a couple of novels over the years that are never going to see the light of day. So I'd had a bit of practice. I mean, you know, practice at doing something badly is still practice. And then I submitted this short fiction to Broken Sleep Books, who very kindly printed this pamphlet. And then I did an MA at Goldsmiths, and during the course of that MA I worked on the novel, because I was like, for me personally, I think it would be useful now to have that kind of academic structure and feedback structure to kind of support writing something long, because it's really difficult to finish a long piece of writing. Like, I think that a short story, you can get to a sort of stage of completion kind of almost on your own, I think, and then kind of have an editor come in after. For me, something long, not the case. It's good to have people that are kind of able to give you good feedback throughout. The journey to the novel was like one of just really writing a lot and trying really hard to produce something, and kind of working with the ideas in it in lots of different ways for a long time. And then after like a very lengthy period of this and that, kind of having the privilege of being able to go down a fairly conventional publishing route, which is getting an agent, then sending your book out, and now and then wrote like the very final draft while I was like 9 months pregnant, and then had my daughter, and then now she's 2, and she's going to turn 2 in like a couple of weeks. So, you know, it's all very sort of
Wow, so it's all all come together.
It's all very something.
Yeah,
just
it's
like
all in
everything
there
in
somewhere,
life.
isn't it? Well, it's amazing. It's an amazing story. What's your daughter's name?
Taryn. So Taryn.
There's that sounds like a really intense period of time in any case, but
yeah, it kind of was. But I think there's good and bad kinds of intensity, and I think that was kind of quite a rewarding sort of intensity. Whereas sometimes you can go through a sort of period of very intense experience and come out the other side just feeling depleted with nothing to show for it. But
novel and a child.
Novel and a child. What more could you ask for?
Well, there you go. That's the past, the present, and the future lining up. Roisin, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you for telling us all about this book and how you wrote it, and some of the inspiration behind it. Out now, and it's published by Magpie Books, which is a new exciting imprint from Oneworld Publications. But for now, Roisin, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much for joining me on Littering.